The next voice you hear is that of the accused assassin of President John F. Kennedy, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yes, I am a Marxist.
These words are typical of the dramatic debate which follows. Now to introduce the uncut, unedited transcription is the Honorable Hale Boggs, Congressman from New Orleans, House Majority Whip, and a close legislative associate of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Congressman Boggs.
You are about to hear an historic recording. This recording was made in New Orleans last year. It is far more significant today in the light of subsequent events. It is to the credit of the private citizens of New Orleans that it was they who first recognized the bizarre and incredible activities of Lee Harvey Oswald and brought him and his activities to the attention of the public. Credit is due to radio station WDSU and to newsman Bill Slatter, who moderated this program so lately. To Latin American Affairs reporter Bill Stuckey, who sought out Oswald and arranged the interview, and to Cuban refugee leader Carlos Bringuier, who refuted his blatant pro-Castro propaganda. And last, but certainly not least, to Ed Butler, Executive Vice President of INCA, the Information Council of the Americas, who developed much new material on Oswald's movements and activities, not only in New Orleans but elsewhere. Let me say a word about the purposes of INCA, the organization which Mr. Butler directs. I have taken a very personal interest in INCA, as I said, a private organization which originated in my own congressional district. On September 17, 1962, I said to my colleagues in Congress that INCA is actively engaged in the defeat of the communist movement through its Truth Tapes program, a program which provides scores of refugees from communist tyranny the opportunity and the forum to relate their experiences on tape recordings for broadcast by radio stations throughout the Americas. In this worthy counterattack, Mr. Butler has been joined by many highly respected private citizens, led by Dr. Alton Ochsner, President of the Information Council of the Americas and an internationally famous surgeon from New Orleans. I conclude my remarks with the statement that such a program as INCA's is a solid, forceful way to counteract red propaganda, infiltration, and subversion. Now, the full, unedited transcription of the panel discussion which took place on the evening of August 21st, 1963 in the city of New Orleans.
WDSU Radio presents Conversation Carte Blanche, next on Cavalcade.
It's time now for Conversation Carte Blanche. Here is Bill Slatter.
Good evening. For the next few minutes, Bill Stuckey and I, Bill whose program you probably heard on Saturday night, Latin Listening Post, Bill and I are going to be talking with three gentlemen, the subject mainly revolving around Cuba. Our guests tonight are Lee Harvey Oswald, who is secretary of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It's a New York headquartered organization which is generally recognized as the principal voice of the Castro government in this country. Our second guest is Ed Butler, who is executive director of the Information Council of the Americas, which is headquartered in New Orleans and specializes in distributing anti-communist educational materials throughout Latin America. And our third guest is Carlos Bringuier, a Cuban refugee and New Orleans delegate of the Revolutionary Student Directorate. It's one of the more active of the anti-Castro refugee organizations. Bill, at this time, if you'll briefly background the situation as you know it.
Thank you, Bill. First, for those who don't know too much about the background of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, this is an organization that specializes primarily in distributing literature and is based in New York. For the several years in which it's been in existence, it has operated principally out of the East and out of the West Coast and a few college campuses. Recently, however, attempts have been made to organize a chapter here in New Orleans. The only member of the group to have revealed himself publicly so far is 23-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, who is the secretary of the local chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He first came to public notice several days ago when he was arrested and convicted for disturbing the peace. The ruckus in which he was involved started when several local Cuban refugees, including Carlos Bringuier, who is with us tonight, discovered him distributing pro-Castro literature on a downtown street. Now, Mr. Oswald and Bringuier are here with us tonight to give us opposing views on the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and its objectives. Now, I believe that I was probably the first New Orleans reporter to interview Mr. Oswald on his activities here since he first came into public view. Last Saturday, in addition to having him on my show, we had a very long and rambling question and answer session over various points of dogma and line of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And now I'll give you a very brief digest of some of the principal propaganda lines. I use the word propaganda as rather, I should say, informational lines of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Number one, the principal thing that they insist is that Castro's government today is completely free and independent and is in no way controlled by the Soviet Union. Another cardinal point of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee's propaganda is that Premier Castro was forced to seek aid from the Russians only because the United States government refused to offer him financial aid. In following another line, I asked Mr. Oswald if he had ever or was a member of the American Communist Party, and he said that the only organization to which he belonged was the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Mr. Oswald also gave me this rundown on his personal background. He said that he was a native of New Orleans, had attended Beauregard Junior High School and Warren Eastern High School, had entered the U.S. Marine Corps in 1956, and was honorably discharged in 1959. He said during our previous interview that he had lived in Fort Worth, Texas before coming here to establish a Fair Play for Cuba chapter several weeks ago. However, there were a few items apparently that I suspect that Mr. Oswald left out of this original interview, which was principally where he lived between 1959 and 1962. Mr. Butler brought some newspaper clippings to my attention, and I also found some through an independent investigation, Washington newspaper clippings to the effect that Mr. Oswald had attempted to renounce his American citizenship in 1959 and become a Soviet citizen. There was another clipping dated 1952 saying that Mr. Oswald had returned from the Soviet Union with his wife and child after having lived there for 3 years. Mr. Oswald, are these correct?
That is correct, yes.
You did live in Russia for 3 years?
That is correct, and I think the fact that I did live for a time in the Soviet Union gives me excellent qualifications to repudiate charges that Cuba and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is communist controlled.
Mr. Bringuier, perhaps you would like to dispute that point.
Well, I want to know exactly the name of the organization that you represent here in the city, because I have some confusion. Is Fair Play for Cuba Committee or Fair Play for Russia Committee?
Well, that is, of course, a very provocative and question. I don't think it requires an answer.
Well, I will tell you why. Because before the communists take over Cuba, Cuba was at the head of the Latin American countries, and I can show you that in Cuba, in 1858, every 37 persons has an automobile, and in Russia was 200 persons for one automobile. In Cuba was 6 persons for one radio, and in Russia was 20 persons for one radio. In Cuba was 1 television set for 18 persons, and in Russia was 85 persons for 1 television set. And in Cuba was 1 telephone for every 38 persons, and in Russia was 1 telephone for every 580 persons. Cuba was selling the sugar in the American market and was receiving from the United States more than $100 million a year over the price of the world market, and the United States was paying to Cuba that price in dollars. Right now, Cuba is selling the sugar to Russia. Russia is paying to Cuba 80% in junks, in machinery from Russia, and 20% in dollar. I think that Cuba right now is a colony of Russia, and the people of Cuba, who is leaving Cuba every day, who is escaping from Cuba every day, they disagree with you that you are representing the people of Cuba. Maybe you will represent the the colony of Russia here in this moment, but not the people of Cuba. You cannot take that responsibility.
Well, in order to give a clear and concise and short answer to each of those, well, let's say questions, I would say that the facts and figures from a country like Pakistan or Burma would even reflect more light upon Cuba in relation to how many television sets and how many radios and all that. This I do not think is a subject to be discussed tonight. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee, as the name implies, is concerned primarily with Cuban-American relations.
How many people do you have in your committee here in New Orleans?
I cannot reveal that as secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Is it a secret society?
No, Mr. Butler, it is not. However, it is a standard operating procedure for a political organization consisting of a political minority to safeguard the names and the number of its members.
Well, the Republicans are in the minority. I don't see them hiding their membership.
The Republicans are not a, well, the Republicans are a established political party representing a great many people. They represent no radical point of view. They do not have a very violent and sometimes emotional opposition as we do.
Oh, I see. Well, would you say then that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not a communist front organization?
The Senate subcommittees who have occupied themselves with investigating the Fair Play for Cuba Committee have found that there is nothing to connect the two committees. We have been investigated from several points of view, that is, points of view of taxes, allegiance, aversion, and so forth. The findings have been, as I say, absolutely zero.
Well, I have the Senate hearings before me, and I think what I have in front of me refutes precisely every statement that you just made. For instance, who is the honorary chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee?
The honorary chairman of this committee, the name of that person, I certainly don't know.
Well, let me tell you, in case you don't know about your own organization.
No, I know about it.
His name is Waldo Frank, and I'm quoting from the New Masses of September 1932. The title of his article is How I Came to Communism, a Symposium, by Waldo Frank, Where I Stand and How I Got There. Now let me ask you a second question. Who is the secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the national secretary?
Well, we have a national director who is Mr. V.T. Lee, who has recently returned from Cuba, and because of the fact that the United States government has imposed restrictions on travel to Cuba, he is now under indictment for his traveling to Cuba. This, however, it's very convenient for rightist organizations to drag out this or that literature purporting to show a fact which has not been established in law. I have said that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee has definitely been investigated. That is very true. I have also said that the total result of that investigation was zero. That is, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not now on the Attorney General's subversive list. Any other material you may have is superfluous.
Mr. Oswald, if I may break in a moment, I believe it was mentioned that you at one time asked to renounce your American citizenship and become a citizen of the Soviet Union. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think that has a particular import to this discussion. We are discussing the Cuban-American relations.
Well, no, I think it has a bearing to this extent, Mr. Oswald. You say, apparently, that Cuba is not dominated by Russia, and yet you apparently, by your own past actions, have shown that you have an affinity for Russia and perhaps communism, although I don't know that you admit that you either are a communist or have been. Could you straighten out that point? Are you or have you been a communist?
Well, I had answered that prior to this program on another radio program.
Are you a Marxist?
Yes, I am a Marxist.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is primarily the difference between a country like Ghana, Guyana, Yugoslavia, China, or Russia. Very, very great differences. Differences which we appreciate by giving aid, let's say, to Yugoslavia in the sum of $100 million or so per year.
That's extraneous. What's the difference?
The difference is, as I said, a very great difference. Many parties, many countries are based on Marxism. Many countries, such as Great Britain, display very socialistic aspects and characteristics. I might point to the socialized medicine of Britain.
Most people.
Gentlemen, I'll have to interrupt. We'll be back in a moment to continue this rather lively discussion after this message.
During the next 2 minutes, the public heard a commercial message and the panelists, saying little, shuffled their papers, preparing for the final round of the debate. The only man in the listening audience who knew the full story of Oswald's defection beforehand was Dr. Alton Ochsner, the world-famous New Orleans surgeon who is president of INCA. Dr. Ochsner, on a world tour as expert consultant to the Surgeon General of the Air Force, has himself confronted delegates from communist China. He has also seen and heard red agitators and propagandists at work in Latin America. Here are his first-hand impressions of Lee Harvey Oswald. Dr. Ochsner.
Thank you. Since I was familiar with Oswald's background, when I heard him smoothly admit his 3-year defection to Russia, I was not overly surprised. But when he tried to use his admission as a proof that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was not communist-controlled, I knew that Ed Butler was facing the same kind of propaganda doublethink that I'd heard so many communists and their sympathizers use in my travels all over the world. However, as the interview went on and the hard-hitting questions and factual evidence piled up, I relaxed. Oswald had obviously met his match. It is important to remember that at that time, Oswald had technically committed no crime. Therefore, no official could prevent him from spreading poison on the airwaves. Nor would any of us who believe in the freedom of speech want a thought control agency to assume such powers. Private citizens must meet the distortion with truth. On the other hand, a professional approach with indisputable facts and a planned strategy is needed if private citizens are to provide the antidote for propaganda poison. Because the full facilities of INCA were available, for a change the propaganda battle was fought evenly. The results speak for themselves. Oswald dropped out of sight immediately after the debate and left New Orleans shortly thereafter. According to published reports, he went to Mexico, where he visited the communist embassies of Russia and Cuba. Then he took up residence in an apartment in a Dallas suburb under the alias of O.H. Lee, where several letters from the same man written on the stationery of both the Communist Party USA and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee were reportedly found. Many who have heard this record have expressed the belief that if an INCA branch office had existed in Dallas, Oswald would again have been exposed and the president might be alive today. No one can say for certain, but as you listen to the second part of this record, think about it and decide for yourself.